about Wireshark is the sort of aha moment that people get when they look at a packet trace and their idea of how a network is supposed to work goes from something very abstract and sort of vague to something very concrete that's represented by what you see on the wire. And sorry. My first aha moment came many, many years ago when I was working at a university and my boss sat me down in front of this thing called a Sniffer. And it's a day I'll never forget because that was my first aha moment, and it led me down a road that took me directly here, where I'm standing on this stage today. And it's also why it's a big honor, and I'm very excited about introducing our keynote speaker this morning. Len Shustek has done a lot of things over his career. He's been an entrepreneur, a venture capitalist, an educator, but he's done two things that are of relevance to what we're doing here today. Up higher? All right. He co-founded Network General, which made the Sniffer, which was the thing that gave me my first aha moment with protocol analysis. And he co-founded the Computer History Museum, which is where we're sitting today, and and the organization that's hosting our conference. But without further ado, I'd like to introduce Len Shustek. Please give him a warm welcome.
Thank you. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for coming so early in the morning. I'm an engineer, so I know how difficult it is to be here at 9 o'clock in the morning. So why am I here? I'm here because 30 years ago, I was co-founder of a company called Network General that built a product called the Sniffer. Now, 30 years ago may be before some of you in this room were even born, although I think I see some gray hair, so maybe some of you recognize the device and know what it is. And, what I want to do is talk a little bit about where the Sniffer came from and what happened to it afterwards. The story actually begins 8 years before we shipped the product in 1986. I was a wet behind the ears assistant professor at Carnegie Mellon. I had just gotten my PhD in computer science from Stanford. And I get a call in Pittsburgh from a friend of mine who I worked with at Stanford who said, "Have you seen these little computers that are starting to come out?" One of our co-founders called them sissy computers because we'd been using big mainframe computers and we're not used to these little things that sat on top of a desktop. They weren't real computers. But my colleague, his name is Harry Saal, S-A-A-L, said, "I've got a great idea. I want to figure out a way to take these little computers, which are so limited in resources, and connect them together in a network." Now, we knew about networks because we'd worked in academic institutions, and ARPANET was around. This was before the internet, but the ARPANET was around, and we knew the value of networks and sharing resources among computers. So he said, "Why don't you take a 6-month leave of absence from your new faculty position at Carnegie Mellon? You know how to build products. Help me get this company off the ground." Well, maybe they're still waiting for me to come back at Carnegie Mellon, because I never came back after that 6-month leave of absence, and we started building networks of personal computers. We started a company called Nestar Systems, and we networked together Commodore PETs, Apple IIs, and Radio Shack TRS-80s. And the primary product was a file server. The CPU for the file server was a Commodore PET. Now, this is an 8-bit microprocessor with, 8 or 16 bytes of memory? The storage was this newfangled device that had just come out called a floppy disk, an 8-inch floppy disk, 600 bytes on each one. So we had a whopping 1.2 megabytes of storage attached to this Commodore PET. Now, what did we use for a network? Now, Ethernet had just come out by people at Xerox PARC, but it was way too expensive to build interfaces to Ethernet. There weren't any chips yet that implemented Ethernet. The Commodore PET, as it turned out, had what was called the IEEE 488, an HP instrumentation bus built into it. So he said, fine, we'll do that. 26-wire flat cable. We'll wire up all these computers with flat cable. build interfaces for the Apple II and the TRS-80 that didn't have that bus built into it, and have a network. And that's what we did. Now, we were engineers. We didn't know the first thing about actually making a company and selling product, but we knew we had to tell people about it, so we called up a friend of ours at the now defunct local newspaper, the Palo Alto Times, and they kindly ran a little article about it. That picture is Harry Saul, and in fact, that's his garage on Garland Street in Palo Alto, which is where we started the company and had our first manufacturing facility. We got some other press. This is an article from Electronic Engineering Times, also from '79, I think it is, something like that. And we tried to sell these things to schools primarily and other people who wanted to use these personal computers and share devices like disks and printers. We made our second version based on the Apple II as the file server and built file servers and print servers and all sorts of stuff that you would recognize now out of components that you wouldn't recognize. It was tough to sell this stuff. I want to have a slight diversion here. What happens to all of this old equipment? That's the original Sniffer down there. It's based on a compact portable 2 computer. They're hardly around anywhere. Well, the right place for all of this stuff is, of course, a museum. And you're sitting in a museum. This museum has about 100,000 things, 38,000 physical objects, but also photographs and videos and oral histories and documents and pieces of software. And of course, the pieces of software I'm talking about are part of the collection. That's the network interface board for the Apple II, for our Cluster 1 network. Looks like it's in prison. That's the accession number for the museum. One of the things I've been doing recently as chairman of the museum is pushing us to preserve not only physical objects, but also software. And not only packaged and running software, but the original source code. In some ways, source code is the literature of computer science. It tells people what was in the mind of the developer, what were the problems they were addressing, how did they get around issues. So we're trying as much as we can to preserve software source code. And I encourage you, if you have code you think is historic, talk to us about getting it into the museum and preserving it. That's an example of the source code for our file server. It's in 6502 assembly language for the Commodore PET microprocessor, now preserved. Now, of course, we had to start advertising these devices. We ran ads. We tried to convince people that you could do local networking with these silly little sissy computers. And we started running ads in big magazines, PC Week, and others. We began to get some traction. It was difficult because this was 79, 80. The IBM PC had not come out yet. So corporations generally treated all of these computers as toys, and they wouldn't buy them. Our only potential customers were schools, and schools didn't have any money. So selling was tough. But I was running engineering. That didn't keep me from designing more and more products. And here are a series of our file servers, small, medium, and large. Eventually, the Apple II as the file server engine kind of ran out of gas. So we started using 68,000 boards. One of my friends was the founder of Sun Microsystems, and they were licensing their 68,000 based boards to all sorts of people for use, and we were one of the licensees. So that planned 4,000 and 5,000 servers you see in the center on the right were based on 68,000 with, my God, 0.5 megabyte of memory or something like that. We were busy. We were building file servers, initially out of the Commodore PET and the Apple II, but then the 68,000 boards. We had redundancy. We had shadow file servers that would keep your data backed up. Of course, we had backups on cartridge tapes. We did print servers. We did file transfer servers so that sites could be linked across phone lines using modems in a transparent fashion. We had a telex server. Most of you in this room don't know what a telex is, but it was a way to send and receive essentially telegrams, which was still active, and we automated that process by building servers for it. We wrote applications for the client computers. We had an early email client called the Messenger that I wrote. We had a chat program called Talk. We had a database server based on a PC database called DB Master. So we were going great guns. And then what happened? We went out of business. Ran it for 8 years, 1978, 1986, and just couldn't get any traction. Now, I could talk for a long time about why I think we failed. Here are some of the reasons. We were just too early. You know, pioneers are the people who get the arrows from both sides. We were a pioneer in days when we were making bets on the only technology available, which was too early. We made bad bets on our kind of local area networks. You know, we had 2 versions of our proprietary flat cable network. Then we decided, well, we'll standardize on a network that some other big company is supporting that looks technically really good, and it was. It was called Data Point ArcNet. How many people are still running ArcNet? It turns out to have been a great network for all sorts of reasons that I won't bore you with, but didn't become a standard. Data Point was not interested in making it a standard. So we said, okay, we'll support IBM. IBM was coming out with this great network called Token Ring. Nobody ever loses by supporting IBM, so we became big IBM proponents. Bad choice. On the software side, TCP/IP was an academic network that was not going anywhere. All of the government interest was in OSI, the government-supported internetworking, and that was clearly too complicated to run on an Apple II. So we decided to adopt a version of Xerox's network system, XNS network protocols, which were great and got totally wiped out by TCP/IP. So we made a bunch of bad technology bets for good technological reasons, and companies like Corvus and Novell just ate our lunch. We went out of business. Now, we're in good company. At the museum, we like preserving the history of failures. You learn a lot by failures. You shouldn't write failures out of history. And I want to go through another example of a failure in computing history going way back. I mean, here's an example of a failed invention by a computer pioneer. This is a way of using recycled library books to walk on water. You strap them to your feet, and as you push the book down onto the water, the leaves open up, and you can begin to walk. Well, this wasn't a particularly popular or successful invention either, but I'll talk to you in a minute about who invented it. Who invented things is a really interesting question. The most embarrassing question that people ask us at the museum is, who invented the computer? We all want a simple answer. You know, everybody knows who invented the telephone. Everybody knows who invented the light bulb. So everybody should know who invented the computer. Right. Steve and Steve. Well, maybe it's not Steve and Steve. Maybe it's Paul and Bill. Well, I think you know that those are not the right answers. The fact is, there are no right answers. There's a movie down in the exhibit in the museum below that talks about who invented the computer and goes through a dozen different people who made important contributions. But if you line me up against a wall and say, okay, you have to give one answer, who is the inventor of the computer? It's the guy who invented how to walk on water using those library books. His name was Charles Babbage. Now, Charles Babbage was the son of a wealthy banker who didn't need to work for a living, and he devoted his life to mathematics. And in particular, the way you did mathematics in those days was to look up answers in printed tables. If you wanted to find a logarithm or a sine, there was a table, you looked it up. And at one point, he compared all these tables and discovered that they were all different, which meant that one or all of them were wrong. And at one point, he said, I wish to God these calculations had been executed by steam, which was a Victorian metaphor for doing it by a calculator, a machine that would make no mistakes. All of these tables were done by hand and had lots of mistakes. Okay, we know how to compute those functions like logarithms. There are polynomial expansions like the one on the bottom. Now, multiplication built out of mechanical calculators, which was the technology he had available at the time, was really hard to do. But it turns out there's a very clever and easy way to compute those polynomial expansions without having to do any multiplications. It's called the method of differences. I won't go into the details. You probably know this. But if you take an nth order polynomial, like a sixth order polynomial, and keep taking the differences between successive values, the nth column, the sixth column, is a constant. Well, if that's the case, then you can compute the next number in series just by doing n additions. Babbage said, that's great. I know how to build a machine that can do additions. So he decided to build a machine, basically an automatic adder, that uses the method of differences to compute polynomials and produce these tables without any mistakes. So he began constructing this machine in 1823. It was designed to do 6 differences, so a sixth order polynomial. It was calculating using 16-digit decimal numbers. This was a decimal computer, not a binary computer. It was a digital computer, not an analog computer, right? It was quantized. There were no intermediate values. And he realized that an important part in making the tables without any mistakes was to eliminate the typesetter. So he designed a printer that would automatically print the table at the end of the machine. So how did he do? He did all this design work. He got the venture capitalist of the day, which is Her Majesty Queen Victoria, to put in 17,000 pounds, which is about $2 million. And he worked for 19 years building this machine. It would have required 25,000 parts had he finished it. But he only built 12,000 of them, and the project collapsed. The only thing we have left of that project is a little prototype piece that is a 3-column, three differences, 7-digit machine that works perfectly. The original is in the London Science Museum. We have a replica downstairs in the exhibit. So he was a failure. That didn't stop him, though. He went on to design another version of that machine. He called it difference engine number 2. He figured out a way to design that machine with 1/3 the number of parts. He made these exquisitely detailed drawings of that difference engine number 2, that machine. And he made no attempt to build it. He had no credibility with his funder, Queen Victoria, and the chief scientist of the time, John Biddle-Airy, who was the royal astronomer, said, that machine would be worthless. Why should we spend all of our time and money building that machine when we could hire a bunch of people with pencils and paper at desks to do the computation? So one of the questions was Babbage a genius or a nutcase? Would any of these machines ever have worked? Well, in the 1990s, the London Science Museum attempted to answer that question by taking Babbage's original drawings for difference engine number 2 and building the machine exactly the way Babbage could have built it. They took 17 years, almost as long as Babbage took, cost about $2 million. They made all of the 8,000 parts that the engine required, and it works perfectly. The guy who was responsible for it is Doran Swade, who was then curator of computing at the London Science Museum. The machine is 8 feet tall, 12 feet wide, weighs I forget how many tons. It's got a crank at one end. Every 4 times you turn the crank, it prints another number of the table with 100% accuracy in the piece of paper on the left. We actually had this machine here at the museum for 7 years on loan to us. And if you were here last year or the year before, you might have seen it. Unfortunately, it's gone now. The guy who owns it decided he wants it for himself, which is fair enough. So Babbage, in fact, was a genius, even though he was a failure. The irony is that in between designing the first difference engine and the second difference engine, he also designed the world's first computer. He called it the analytical engine. And of course, based on his failure, he made no attempt to build this. It was a computer as we know it today. It had a CPU and a memory. It had pipelining and parallel processing. It had conditional branches and loops. It was even a micro-coded machine. And of course, it had software. The software was going to be stored on punched cards. Some of you may remember punched cards, although not ones in that form. But he made no attempt to build it. Now, Babbage died an old man, bitter and disappointed, because nothing he had ever designed worked, with one exception. He invented the cow catcher on the front of the locomotive. That was his only successful invention. But it's an important story to learn about failures and progress from them. We had a failure at Nestar. We were not able to make a success of building local area and access personal computers. But we learned things from it. Well, one of the lessons we learned is that networking is really hard. You think you just wire together these machines and sprinkle a little software dust on it, and somehow they all communicate with each other. Well, it wasn't so easy for us, wasn't so easy for our customers. One of the things we had done inside Nestar is to build a little tool to help us with it. It was an engineering department skunkworks tool. It was called TART, Transmit and Receive Totalizer, because it was a promiscuous receiver. And it was actually designed by our subsidiary in the UK. We had a bunch of engineers in a facility in Uxbridge, north of London. And they designed a piece of hardware and some software that could become a promiscuous receiver. Now, this was for one of our networks. It was ArcNet. ArcNet was implemented by a chip. You see that big chip on the upper right that didn't allow promiscuous reception. So this little black wart on the back of the board was some custom hardware that made every packet look like a broadcast, so that this chip could be programmed to receive every packet on the network, whether or not it was designed for this station. That's great. By the way, we decided for both of our companies that we weren't patenting things, so we would just keep things secret. We wanted to keep this secret because it violated the security of the network, so we potted it. We put it in this adhesive epoxy so that nobody could see what the magic was that made that promiscuous receiver work. Well, we sprinkled some software on this, which I'll show you in a second, and it was great. We used it internally at Nestar to diagnose our networks. When customers saw it, they begged us for one. It wasn't a product, but they said, please, can we have one of these things? We would make them, 3 and 4 at a time in the back room. And they would beg us, we'll pay whatever you ask. We want one of these things. The software, by the way, this was, what was this running on? This was running on an early IBM PC. This was probably 83. Was in BASIC. Here's some of the original source code in BASIC. This is the packet filtering source code based on source and destination station addresses. So this was a great product. Nestar's networks weren't doing so well, but this diagnostic tool for networks, that seemed to be a hit. So when Nestar ended, I shouldn't say they went out of business, because we actually sold the assets of the company to a company in Texas called Digital Switch Corporation. We had 100 employees at the time. Probably half of them continued on and worked for DSC for a while. They got all of our shares in the company, and the only thing we asked for was the rights to this little internal test tool. And Harry Saul and I, started over again, just the two of us, to begin another company. We called it Network General, and our goals were modest. Our idea was that we would make this TART project into a product. We called it the Sniffer. Our goal was to sell 100 of them, and then figure out what would we do when we grew up. We didn't really think that that could be the basis of a real company. So we knew it should be based on the IBM PC. I went to the first Windows developer conference, because Windows had just been announced by Microsoft. And it was pretty clear to me that Windows wasn't ready for prime time. Look, this was a real-time, we needed a real-time operating system. This was packet capture in real time. The boards didn't have much of a processor on them, so a lot of the processing and analysis had to be done in the PC. There was no way that Windows was going to be able to support something like that. So I decided that we would use a text-based interface. This was a 25 by 80 column text-based screen. We designed our own user interface. By the way, one of the machines is down on the floor beneath me. It was based on the Compaq Portable 2 processor with an 8086 inside it. Our windowing system was homegrown. The menuing system was based on something that Harry had seen at DataPoint for their file browser, with 3 windows, where the center window was what you were looking at, the window to the left was where you came from, and the window to the right was what you could do after that. So we implemented that. By the way, the logo on the left was animated. The first version was for token ring, so that little dot in the upper right corner of the Network General logo was a token, and it would be spinning around. When we later did an Ethernet sniffer, we had multiple little tokens colliding with each other, creating little stars. So we were having fun in the engineering department. It was also nice not to have to write the code in BASIC. We were able to use C. So all of the code was written in an early version of C for the IBM PC, with, of course, some 8086 assembly language support underneath. So that was my job. I was the one-man engineering team, so my job was to build the product. And then, of course, we had to advertise and sell the product. So Harry Saul was the CEO, I was the VP of engineering. Harry's wife came on board as the 3rd employee, Carol Saul, and she became the marketing department. And we started producing brochures to describe the sniffer. We, by the way, had no venture capital investment. All of us took no salary, and we funded whatever expenses we had from our own checkbook. Worked okay. Then we had to decide, what do you charge for this thing? Right? This was the first and probably only disagreement that Harry and I ever had. I mean, look at what it costs us. The Compaq Portable 2 was an expensive computer. It cost about $1,800. The network adapter, which we were building because they were custom for all the various networks, and they sometimes had to have special hardware to do promiscuous reception, cost $200. The software cost nothing, $10 for the floppy disk and whatever. So the total cost was just over $2,000. I'd taken economics in college. I knew about markups and gross margins and that sort of stuff. So I said, let's mark it up 40%. That would be great. $2,800. We'll make money at that. And Harry said, charge $25,000. It's worth it. People will pay it. So I swallowed hard and I said, sure, let's give that a shot. We went into manufacturing. We bought Compaq Portable 2s. We set up bread racks in this little office we were in and burned them in and inserted the software and the network card. And then we had to sell it. So we had this idea from employee number 4. George, are you here? George, raise your hand. That's George Comstock. George Comstock is my favorite 93-year-old. But when he joined us in 1986, he came over to have pizza for lunch with us and decided he liked what we were doing and he wanted to join, even though he was retired. George had been the founder of Diablo, the company that made daisy wheel printers, sold that to Xerox, and was looking for his next gig. And we said, well, Harry's got the CEO job covered, I've got the engineering job covered, Carol's got the marketing job covered. The only thing we don't have covered is sales and marketing. And you've never done that. And George says, that sounds like fun, I'll do that. So we hired him for no salary. And George had this great idea to use manufacturers' reps to sell the product, not to hire our own sales force, and not to try to demonstrate the product ourselves. And that worked spectacularly well. The important feature was demoing it at the customer. You would take this device to the customer site, you'd plug it in their network, you'd press the one button you needed to get it started, and people's eyes would go agog. I mean, it's the kind of thing that you just heard, that when you see what's really going on in your network, as opposed to what you think is going on in your network, the blinders are taken off your eyes. I mean, people would say, look at all these passwords going by on the network in clear text. Maybe I ought to encrypt this stuff. So by and large, even at $25,000 a pop, the Sniffer sold itself. Now, part of it was we made a very important attempt to support lots of networks, lots of protocol interpreters. That's an article on the right showing our announcement of the Apple Talk network support for the network and the protocol interpreter. So whatever network you were running, we supported. We sold all we could make at $25,000. In 1986, we sold 8 Sniffers. We had 4 employees, the last of the 4 being George. By 1995, we were selling 1,000 Sniffers a month and had 1,000 employees. And in the early days, I was part of the sales team. I would help go out and sell this thing, and I would sell to engineers primarily. And every once in a while, I'd get pushback and saying, this is a PC with a board and some software. I could build that myself. Why should I spend $25,000 on it? And my response was, yeah, you could. You could also build your own oscilloscope. But that's not the business you're in. You're in the business of building your product. You should buy whatever tools gets you on the way to doing that more quickly. And in this grand scheme of things, $25,000 is not a big number. That was a good argument. Seemed to work. Huge success. It was quite a ride. By 1995, we had revenue of $160 million selling Sniffers. I realize that by internet standards these days, that's actually a small number. Microsoft yesterday bought LinkedIn for $28 billion, and they don't even make any hardware. They just make software. But it was a great ride. And it was a pleasure being part of the team that did that. And the employees in the company were, and the manufacturers' reps that we hired were spectacular. A little bit about the product. That was the main screen that I showed. One of the important things was that we had a manual. We have a manual down here you can take a look at. But we knew that nobody was going to read the effing manual. Everything had to be obvious from what was on the screen. So there are hints and directions on the screen, right? There's a button on the bottom saying new capture. You start it up. This is what you see. You press the F10 button, and it starts capturing. Right? This is an example of setting capture filters. Here's an example of the center is the thing that you're focused on. The right panel is where you can go to. The left panel is where you came from. You press the capture button, and it starts capturing. It shows you the traffic rate. It shows you the traffic to and from individual stations. You press the display button, and it shows you a list of the packets interpreted at the highest level of protocol that we knew at the time. We started this 3-panel display, which is now very common, where you see the summary on the top, you see the detail for the particular selected packet in the middle, and then you see the raw data at the bottom, where it's highlighting the section of it that is highlighted in the detail window. This has now become standard. Now, all of this is based on a text mode 25 by 80 screen. So sometimes we kind of reach the limit of what you can display on a screen like this. This was side-by-side demonstration in 3 windows of 2 different packets, so you could compare 2 packets. It was really handy, but the windows are getting really small. But people loved it. We had competition. Here are 2 examples. Exelan was a network manufacturer, and they had as one of their products a sniffer-like device called Lanalyzer. HP had a product called the 4952, based on one of their instruments. And they were both credible. We did a better job, in part because we were focused entirely on building sniffers. If you do a startup, you've got to focus. Sniffers are us. Sniffers was our business. Exelan was building all sorts of networking stuff. HP, was a widely diversified company. We were focused on sniffers and tried to protect it. We got a trademark on the word sniffer. That was a challenge, by the way, because sniffer can mean a lot of different things. When Harry Saul tried to get, and successfully did eventually, get sniffer on his license plate, the Department of Motor Vehicles was a little suspicious. They thought it had to do with illicit drug use or something like that. But he eventually made the argument, and we tried to protect the sniffer. So this is an ad from the Wall Street Journal that says, we own the registration mark for sniffer. We don't want to see it become a generic word like Kleenex. So it eventually did, of course, but you know that story. So why was it so successful? I think the #1 reason was ease of use. Look, engineers and network managers are focused on doing their job. They don't want to spend time learning about how to do things, you know, how the tool works. They want it to be easy to use, and that was our #1 priority in designing the product, was making it easy to use. The second thing was that we could apply it to anything. So we were obsessive about reverse engineering proprietary protocols. There were many protocols at the time, many more than there are now, that were not in the public domain. They were not documented. But we did what we could, that was legal, to understand how those protocols worked and build protocol interpreters for them. And of course, we supported lots of different network types, starting with token ring, then Ethernet. I guess I have a chart of that. These are some of the standard protocol interpreters that came with the sniffer when you bought it. You know, Banyan Vines, that was a tough one to do because it was an undocumented protocol, but it looked like it was up and coming, and we had lots of customer requests for it. Xerox XNS protocols was still very popular. TCP/IP was on the list, but TCP/IP was not at all clearly the winner at that point. And we were supporting lots of different network types, some of which came and went during the time that we were in existence. Now, doing protocol analysis and looking at the results is okay if you know enough about the network to understand what you're seeing. A lot of people didn't. Local area networks were new. So we ran a school. We ran a school for LAN managers called Sniffer University, where we would teach you how to use the sniffer to diagnose problems on your network. Eventually, we started building that knowledge into the sniffer itself, and we had a version called the Expert Sniffer that would try to figure out what's going wrong in the network. Why can't this guy log in to that server, right? Is it a password problem? Is it a protocol problem? Is it a versioning problem? You know, are the acts getting lost? There are, you know, a dozen different standard reasons why you have trouble, and we tried to build that into the sniffer. As networks got more complicated and had lots of segments, we also realized you want to be able to monitoring all of the segments. So we had something called the distributed sniffer, where you could put these little black boxes attached to a network segment, and they would all communicate back to the mothership. By now, we were implementing things in Windows. They would communicate back to the mothership across whatever network they could find that was still working, and you could, from one location, monitor the health of all of your network segments. We also moved down to the low end. We started, we bought a product from a sort of one-man shop in New Jersey called a Watchdog, which was a network performance analyzer. And you could, at very low cost, you could attach it to network segments and monitor the health and performance of the network. So we began to diversify our product offerings. But this is good and bad news. I mean, the fact that our revenue went from 0 to $160 or $170 million over 10 years was a problem, because we were a public company now. We had gone public in 1989, 3 years after we were funded, when we had 29 employees. We were getting a lot of pressure from the public market to grow. Now, if we were a private company, you could stay focused on a single product and probably make a pretty successful business out of it, but you couldn't be growing at the rates that the public markets expect you to. So how do you grow? Well, you grow in the usual way, by merging. And this is where the story gets complicated. Network General merged. This was about 95, 94, 95, something like that. We merged with McAfee, which was the biggest producer of antivirus software at the time. Now, what does antivirus have to do with network diagnostic and sniffers? Well, I'm not sure. We merged with PGP, the pretty good privacy company that was doing encryption for networks. Was that an exact match? Well, I'm not sure. We created a company called Network Associates, Network from Network General, Associates from McAfee Associates, and became a much larger company, thousands of employees. We had our name on the Oakland Coliseum for a while. We had a big high-rise building over in Santa Clara. Harry and I were not interested in being part of this. And about 95 was the time when Harry and I left the company. And the fellow in charge had come from McAfee. He was now running this conglomerate. And we went off to our next phases of life. I mean, I decided I wanted to start a museum. So in 1996, I started the museum that you are now sitting in. Harry went off to do a bunch of other things. The future history is complicated, and I'm not sure I even understand it, but like most mergers of companies that only are approximately aligned, it didn't end well. Network Associates came apart. Both McAfee and Network General spun out. McAfee became an independent company again. They got bought by Intel. Network General became an independent public company again. And then they got taken private by some of the investors. And then they got sold to NetScout, which was originally one of our competitors, but I think was also bought by Network Associates, if I remember correctly. But it was a good time for us to leave. It was a good time for the registered trademark on Sniffer to disappear. Nobody cared about it. And at this point, network sniffing was an open source activity. So the Sniffer, I'm happy to say, lives on, and all of you are part of that next life of the Sniffer. And I thank you for keeping the tradition on, and I'm happy that the registered trademark has now disappeared. I want to end by giving a little commercial, a commercial about the museum. When I left Network General in 95, I went back to my first profession, which was being a university professor, and I taught some courses at Stanford. And I was upset that, unlike the same courses I had taken 25 years earlier, history had been removed from the curriculum, which was a shame. You know, a physicist learns about Newton and Einstein, and a chemist learns about Lavoisier. Why don't computer scientists learn about Babbage and Turing and von Neumann? And I wasn't going to change the university curriculum, especially since the new president of the university was a computer scientist, and he had no inclination. He had just written the textbook. So I decided what I would do is start a museum. And I got a leg up by realizing we could rescue a museum that had been started 15 years earlier in Boston called the Computer Museum that was not doing well. So we stole it and we moved it to California. And that became the seed corn of the museum, which now has multiple activities. We have, of course, lots of things we collect, but then we do exhibits, both real ones and on the web. We do public programs, lectures, and workshops. We become an information source for people doing history and journalists writing stories about computers. We write history ourselves. We have a big education department trying to get kids interested in this field, but with an historical perspective. We run weekend seminars for, in particular, middle school kids, trying to get them excited and realize that they're part of a long tradition. We do corporate archiving. We just are wrapping up a big project with Cisco, helping them preserve the history of their corporation. We have two new initiatives, one focused on software, the history of software, the Software History Center, and one focused on entrepreneurship and understanding this magical dance that happens particularly in Silicon Valley between engineers, entrepreneurs, and venture capitalists. So we're busy. We have a $10 million budget. We're always in the black. We have 70 employees and 150 volunteers. If you want to volunteer, please let us know. We love having volunteers working on all sorts of things. Our warehouse, like most museums, we can't put everything we have on display. So we have a warehouse 20 minutes away where we store all of those 50,000 objects that are not on display. We have recently bought a third building not far away from there, which is an archival and research center where we're doing the work on the documents and the videos and the photos and the software and the source code and all of that stuff. And if you haven't seen it, we have a big exhibit downstairs called Revolution, the First 2,000 Years of Computing. It's 25,000 square feet. It's worth your visit if you haven't seen it. It tries to tell the whole story of computing, beginning with some amazing devices invented by the Greeks in the first century before the Common Era. We talk about mainframe computers. We talk about personal computers. And we're always doing new things. There's an exhibit downstairs as well on self-driving cars. We have some running computers. We have 2 computer installations downstairs, one of which is an IBM 1401, the most popular computer in the world in about 1962. We also have a running DEC mini computer, the PDP-1, which is famous for running Space War. And to show you how close we are to the pioneering generations of these early computers, the fellow who wrote Space War in about 1962 as a graduate student at MIT, Slug Russell, is one of our docents. And he demonstrates Space War running on the machine 40 years later, 50 years later. Nobody ever beats him, by the way. So I'm having great fun at the museum. I hope you as visitors and maybe as potential volunteers can have great fun as well. That's the end. I'm be happy to take questions about either the museum or the early days of Sniffers. Thank you very much.